Good evening, my friend, and welcome. Tonight, leave the noise of the day behind as we wander into another quiet chapter of the past. There's no rush here, no need to stay wide awake. Just settle into a comfortable place, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to unfold at its own gentle pace. If these peaceful journeys help you relax or drift off to sleep, you're always welcome to return for another adventure. Your support simply by being here means more than you know. Now, imagine the world growing quieter with every passing moment. The lights fade, the air feels calm, and the worries of today slowly slip away. As the night wraps gently around us, we'll open the door to another forgotten place where history whispers instead of shouts, and every step brings us a little closer to peaceful sleep. And before we begin, if these quiet journeys bring you a little peace at the end of your day, I'd be truly grateful if you chose to support this channel by subscribing. A gentle tap on the like button helps these stories reach others who may need a peaceful night as well. I'd also love to hear from you. Instead of simply saying hello, tell me one small thing. What part of the world are you listening from tonight? It's always comforting to know that although we're miles apart, we're sharing this quiet moment together. Now, make yourself comfortable. Let the outside world slowly fade away, and let's begin tonight's story. Tonight, we are going to travel quietly through time. Not quickly, not with the rush of modern life. We will move slowly, gently, 1 year at a time, one town at a time, one distant battlefield at a time. Tonight, we will travel back to a world that existed more than 200 years ago. A world without electricity, a world without telephones, a world without automobiles, a world where a letter could take weeks to cross the ocean, and where a journey of a few hundred miles could take many days. The nights were darker then. The roads were quieter. The forests were larger. And the 13 colonies along the eastern coast of North America were still part of the British Empire. There was no United States of America yet. There was no American president. There was no White House. There was no Washington, D.C. There was no independent American nation. Instead, there were 13 British colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony had its own character, its own towns, its own farms, its own ports, and its own people. Some were farmers, some were merchants, some were fishermen, some were craftsmen, some were wealthy landowners, some were poor workers, some were enslaved, some were free, Some were immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic searching for a new beginning, and many still thought of themselves as British. They spoke English, they followed British laws, they bought British goods, they read British newspapers, and they lived under the authority of the British Crown. For a long time, this arrangement was accepted, but slowly, very slowly, the relationship began to change. Its own political traditions. The change did not begin with a cannon. It did not begin with a declaration. It began with questions. Questions about taxes. Questions about representation. Questions about power. Questions about rights. Questions about who should govern the people living thousands of miles away from London. And eventually, those questions would lead to a revolution. A revolution that would change North America and influence the entire world. So tonight, let the modern world become quiet. Imagine an old wooden house beside a field. Imagine the soft sound of wind moving through trees. Imagine a lantern glowing near a window. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly toward Europe. And somewhere beyond that ocean, in the great city of London, decisions are being made. Decisions that will slowly change the course of history. This is the story of how 13 British colonies became the United States of America. This is the long road to independence. And tonight, we will walk that road slowly. Long before the United States became a nation, the eastern coast of North America was home to 13 British colonies. They stretched along the Atlantic coast. To the north were the New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Further south were New York and New Jersey, then Pennsylvania and Delaware. Further south still were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony was different. Massachusetts had busy ports and strong religious traditions. Virginia had large plantations and practiced the slave trade. The North Carolina colony was known for its tall trees and producing pine. The Georgia colony was founded as a place for debtors and for British soldiers. These colonies were all British colonies, and they were all ruled by the King of England. He was the ruler of all 3 colonies. He had his own laws, and he had his own rules. The king ruled from thousands of miles away. He did not live in the colonies. Virginia had large plantations and powerful landowners. Pennsylvania had the growing city of Philadelphia. New York had an important harbor. South Carolina had wealthy plantation communities. Georgia was the youngest of the 13 colonies. Yet, despite their differences, they were connected by the British Empire. The colonies had local assemblies. They passed local laws. They collected certain local taxes. They managed many internal matters. And because of this, many colonists became accustomed to governing themselves. They were not fully independent, but they had developed their own political habits. They had local representatives. They held meetings. They debated laws. They voted in colonial elections. And And over generations, they developed a strong sense that government should care for their people. This idea was important because later, when Britain attempted to exercise greater control over the colonies, many colonists felt that something fundamental was being threatened. But before that conflict began, there was another war. A great war. A war between Britain and France. The conflict would become known in North America as the French and Indian War. It was part of a much larger global conflict called the 7 Years' War. Britain and France were competing for territory and influence. Their struggle was not limited to Europe. It spread across North America. Native American nations became involved in different ways. European empires competed for control of land and trade. British and French soldiers fought across forests and rivers. And eventually, Britain emerged victorious. France lost much of its mainland territory in North America. Britain had won. But victory came at a tremendous cost. The British government had borrowed enormous amounts of money to fight the war. Now, Britain had a problem. The empire needed money. And British leaders believed that the colonies should contribute more. At first, this seemed like a reasonable idea to many people in Britain. After all, British soldiers had defended the colonies, British ships protected colonial trade, and the war had been extremely expensive. But many colonists saw the issue differently. They believed that taxes imposed by Parliament were different from taxes approved by their own colonial assemblies. And then came a new question. Could Parliament tax people who had no elected representatives in Parliament? That question would become one of the central conflicts of the American Revolution. The year was 1765. Britain passed the Stamp Act. The law required many printed materials in the colonies to carry a tax stamp. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, pamphlets, and other printed items. The law was not necessarily enormous in financial terms, but its political meaning was much greater. Colonists began to protest. In towns and cities, people gathered. Merchants organized boycotts. Political leaders wrote letters. Newspapers published arguments. And a phrase began to spread. No taxation without representation. The argument was simple. If the people were going to be taxed, they believed they should have representatives in the government imposing the tax. The British government disagreed. Parliament believed it had authority over the empire. The colonists increasingly believed that Parliament was going beyond its legitimate powers. The disagreement grew. But the Stamp Act was eventually repealed. For a short time, it seemed possible that the crisis might fade. But it did not. The fundamental disagreement remained. who had the final authority over the colonies? Britain? Parliament? The colonial assemblies? The king? Or the people themselves? Nobody yet knew the answer. And nobody yet knew that these questions would eventually lead to independence. Among all the colonies, Boston became one of the most important centers of resistance. Boston was a busy port. Ships entered and left the harbor. Merchants traded goods. Workers filled the streets. Political discussions filled taverns and meeting houses, and tensions with British officials grew. British troops were stationed in Boston. To British leaders, the soldiers were there to maintain order. To many colonists, the soldiers represented unwanted military control. The relationship between civilians and soldiers became increasingly tense. Arguments broke out. Insults were exchanged. Crowds gathered. And in March of 1770, a confrontation took place that became famous as the Boston Massacre. A group of British soldiers faced a crowd. Tensions rose. Shots were fired. Several colonists were killed. The event was quickly turned into a political symbol. Patriot leaders used the deaths to argue that British military power was threatening colonial liberty. Images of the event were circulated. Newspapers described what had happened. The emotional impact spread far beyond Boston. The British government and colonial protesters increasingly viewed one another with suspicion. Yet even then, the colonies were not united in their desire for independence. Many people still wanted reconciliation. Some wanted stronger colonial rights within the British Empire. Some supported the king. Some wanted to avoid conflict entirely. There was no single American opinion. There were arguments everywhere. But the disagreements kept growing. And then, the subject of tea became the next great crisis. Tea was one of the most popular goods in the colonies. It was also politically important. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. The law helped the British East India Company sell tea in the colonies while maintaining the existing tea tax. The British government believed the law would make tea cheaper and help stabilize the company. But colonial protesters saw something else. They feared that accepting the tea would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. Resistance spread. In Boston, several ships carrying tea arrived in the harbor. The question became simple. Would the tea be unloaded? Would the tax be paid? Or would the ships be forced to leave? The conflict reached a dramatic moment in December 1773. At night, men associated with the resistance boarded the ships. Tea chests were opened, and thousands of pounds of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. The event became famous as the Boston Tea Party. The water of the harbor carried away the tea, but politically, the event was only beginning. The punishment helped create greater cooperation among them. Representatives from the colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They formed the First Continental Congress. They debated what should be done. They wrote petitions. They discussed resistance. They hoped Britain might change course. But while politicians debated, ordinary people were beginning to prepare for something darker: war. Spring arrived in 1775. The air in New England was cool. The fields were becoming green. Farmers prepared for another season. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, tension was rising. Colonial militia units were drilling. Supplies were being stored. People were watching the movements of British troops. Then came the night of April 18. British troops left Boston. Their mission was connected to colonial military supplies and resistance leaders. Messengers carried warnings through the countryside. Among them was Paul Revere. The famous ride became part of American history. Village bells rang. Riders moved from house to house. People woke from sleep. Farmers reached for their muskets. Militia members gathered, and by the morning of April 19th, British troops had reached Lexington. There, a group of colonial militia stood waiting. No one could know that the first shots would become so famous. The opposing sides faced one another. The situation was tense. Then, gunfire erupted. Men fell. And the American Revolutionary War had begun. The British moved toward Concord, but colonial resistance increased. At the North Bridge, American militia confronted British soldiers. Fighting followed. The British began their return toward Boston, but the countryside had changed. Militia members appeared from surrounding communities. They fired from behind walls, trees, and buildings. The British column suffered increasing pressure. By the time the soldiers reached Boston, the peaceful political dispute had become a real war. The colonies were in rebellion. There was no turning back. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. The delegates faced a frightening reality. There was now a war. They needed an army, and they needed someone to command it. One name stood above the others: George Washington. Washington was a Virginian. He had military experience from the French and Indian War. He was respected. He was wealthy. He understood military organization. And perhaps most importantly, he came from the South.
Choosing a Virginian helped make the revolutionary movement feel less like a New England rebellion and more like a continental cause. Washington accepted command. He traveled north toward Massachusetts. He found an army surrounding Boston, but it was not yet a modern, professional army. The soldiers came from different colonies. They had different levels of training. Some were experienced, some were not. Many lacked proper equipment. Food was often limited. Money was always a problem.
Clothing was difficult to obtain, and soldiers did not necessarily enlist for long periods. Washington had to build an army while fighting a powerful empire. It would be one of the greatest challenges of his life. In June 1775, fighting around Boston reached a major moment at Bunker Hill. The British eventually captured the American position, but their losses were severe. The battle showed that the colonial forces could stand against experienced British troops. The war would not be easy, and it would not be short. At first, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They did not all want independence. They wanted their rights. They wanted changes. They wanted Parliament to stop what they considered unjust policies. But the political situation grew harder. The king rejected the idea that the colonies could dictate imperial policy. In 1775, King George III formally treated the colonies as being in rebellion. The political gap became wider. Meanwhile, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was written in language ordinary people could understand. Paine argued that it made little sense for a continent to remain politically dependent on a distant monarchy. His words spread rapidly. The idea of independence became more acceptable. In Philadelphia, members of Congress began seriously discussing separation. One of the most important moments came in June 1776. Richard Henry Lee proposed that the colonies should be declared free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee to draft the formal declaration. Thomas Jefferson wrote the main draft. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston were also part of the drafting committee. Jefferson was young. Franklin was older. Adams was forceful. The men debated wording. They changed sentences. They removed some passages. And eventually, the document was adopted. July 4, 1776. The Declaration of Independence. The colonies declared that they were no longer part of the British Empire. They claimed the right to become independent states. The Declaration spoke of natural rights. It spoke of government. It spoke of the consent of the governed. And it listed grievances against the king and British authority. The words were powerful, but words alone could not guarantee independence. The Declaration created a new political claim. Now, the Americans had to defend it. The war would continue. The summer of 1776 was dangerous for the American cause. Britain prepared a large military campaign. New York became the center of the struggle. The British understood that controlling New York could weaken the rebellion. A massive British force arrived. Ships filled the waterways. Thousands of soldiers came ashore. Washington's army faced overwhelming pressure. The Americans fought bravely, but they were defeated in important battles. The British gained control of New York City. American forces retreated. Then they retreated again. The Continental Army was in danger of collapse. Soldiers were exhausted. Some left when their enlistments ended. Others became sick. Supplies were scarce. Washington watched his army shrink. The new Declaration of Independence was only months old, yet the military situation looked terrible. The American experiment might fail. Britain was powerful, the revolution was young, and the future was uncertain. Washington needed a victory. Not necessarily a huge victory, just enough to remind soldiers and civilians that the war could still be won. He found his opportunity at the end of the year. Night. December 1776. Winter had arrived. Washington's army was exhausted. The Delaware River lay ahead. Ice floated in the water. The wind was bitter. The soldiers had little comfort. But Washington had a plan. On the night of December 25th, his army began crossing the river. The operation was difficult. Boats moved through darkness. Ice blocked parts of the river. Men struggled with the cold. But they crossed. The target was Trenton. There, Hessian soldiers supporting the British cause were stationed. Before dawn on December 26th, American forces attacked. The battle was brief. The American army won. It was not the largest victory of the war, but it mattered. It restored confidence. The revolution had survived another crisis. Soon afterward came another American victory at Princeton. Washington's army was still alive. The British had not defeated the rebellion. The war continued. And sometimes, in a long struggle, survival itself becomes a form of victory. The year 1777 brought another major British campaign. British leaders hoped to isolate New England from the other colonies. General John Burgoyne led a British force south from Canada. He expected a powerful campaign, but the American countryside was difficult. Roads were poor, forests were thick, supplies were harder to move. American resistance grew. Several battles weakened Burgoyne's army. By autumn, the British position had become increasingly dangerous. American forces surrounded Burgoyne. The fighting reached its decisive stage near Saratoga. In October 1777, Burgoyne surrendered. The victory was enormous for the American cause. The British had lost a major army. But the significance went far beyond the battlefield. European powers had been watching. France, in particular, wanted to weaken Britain. The American victory suggested that the rebellion might succeed, and France decided that helping the Americans could serve French interests. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. French support would become essential. French money helped. French weapons helped. French soldiers helped. and French naval power would later become critical. The American Revolution had become an international war.
Winter came again. Washington's army moved to Valley Forge. There was no great battle there. Instead, there was cold, hunger, disease, exhaustion. The soldiers built wooden huts. They tried to create shelter, but clothing was limited. Shoes were limited. Food could be difficult to obtain. The conditions were terrible. Some soldiers became sick. Some died. Yet the army remained. At Valley Forge, an important transformation
also took place. Baron Friedrich von Steuben helped train the soldiers. He introduced more disciplined methods of marching and military movement. The Continental Army became more organized. The soldiers were not suddenly transformed into an unstoppable force, but they were better prepared. They understood military discipline better. They had survived another difficult winter. And when spring arrived, the army was still there. Washington had succeeded in preserving his most important resource, his army. France's decision to support the American cause changed the balance. Before the alliance, Britain was fighting mainly against the American rebels. After the alliance, Britain had another powerful enemy. French ships could challenge British naval control. French troops could reinforce American forces. French money could support the struggling American government. Benjamin Franklin played a major role in securing French assistance. He traveled to France, he met with diplomats, he negotiated, he built relationships. He became a symbol of the American cause in Europe. The French people admired the idea of the American Revolution. The French government, however, had practical reasons of its own. France wanted to weaken Britain after years of imperial rivalry. So the alliance was based both on shared political ideas and strategic interests. The Americans needed France. France needed the Americans to hurt Britain. And eventually, their cooperation would help create the conditions for the decisive campaign at Yorktown. But before Yorktown, the war moved south. British leaders increasingly turned their attention toward the southern colonies. They hoped to gain territory there. They believed loyalists might support them. The plan achieved important victories. British forces captured Savannah. Later, they captured Charleston. The situation looked dangerous, but controlling cities was not the same as controlling the countryside. American militia continued fighting. The Southern War became brutal. Families were divided. Loyalists fought patriots. Patriots fought loyalists. Communities were destroyed. Horses, cattle, food, and supplies were taken. The conflict became deeply personal. There were no simple lines between two armies. People could live in the same region and support opposite sides. American commander Nathaniel Greene understood that he did not necessarily need to destroy the British army in one battle. He could keep fighting. He could force the British to spend resources. He could retreat when necessary. He could return later. The strategy exhausted British strength. American victories followed. Cowpens was one important example. The British still had strong armies, but their position became harder to maintain. Then
General Cornwallis moved toward Virginia. The path to Yorktown was beginning.
Lord Charles Cornwallis was an experienced British commander. His army had fought across the colonies. In 1781, Cornwallis moved through Virginia. Virginia was important. It was large. It had important farms and plantations. It also had a deep political connection to the Revolutionary cause. A young officer from Virginia, George Washington, had become commander of the Continental Army years earlier. Now, the war was returning to his home state. Cornwallis established his army at Yorktown. The position was near the Chesapeake Bay. The British expected support from the sea. But Washington and his French allies had another plan. The American and French armies were gathering. At first, the British did not know exactly where Washington intended to strike. Washington had spent years worrying about New York. Now, he was preparing to move south. The operation was complicated. Thousands of soldiers had to travel. Supplies had to move. Roads had to be used. Orders had to remain secret. And the French Navy had to cooperate. Everything depended on timing. The moment was approaching. Washington's army began moving toward Virginia. French soldiers marched beside American troops. The two forces were different in language, uniforms, traditions, and experience, but they shared a common goal. They wanted to trap Cornwallis. The journey was long. Soldiers marched along roads through the countryside. Wagons carried supplies. Horses carried equipment. Officers exchanged messages. The plan worked. Cornwallis remained at Yorktown, and gradually, the American and French forces appeared around him. But there was one more problem. Britain had a powerful. The French Navy, therefore, became one of the most important pieces of the entire campaign. The two fleets met near the Chesapeake. The French won the Battle of the Chesapeake. The British fleet could not easily reach Cornwallis. The trap was closing. Land forces surrounded the British army. The sea route was blocked. Cornwallis was isolated. Yorktown had become a cage. September 1781. The American and French armies prepared for the siege. The soldiers began digging trenches. Engineers measured distances. Artillery was positioned. The British defenders prepared their own defenses. Then the bombardment began. Cannon fire echoed across the countryside. The sounds could be heard day and night. Smoke drifted through the air. Earth shook beneath the ground. But the siege was not simply chaos. It was engineering. Careful trenches were dug closer to the British lines. The Americans and French slowly reduced the distance. They moved forward through the night. British defenses were weakened. Then came the assault on the redoubts. Two important British defensive positions had to be captured. American and French soldiers moved forward. The fighting was intense, but the redoubts fell. The Allied forces were now dangerously close. Cornwallis faced an impossible situation. His army was surrounded. His supplies were running low. The British Navy could not rescue him. The Allied artillery was becoming stronger. On October 17, Cornwallis asked for terms. 2 days later, October 19, 1781, the British Army at Yorktown surrendered. The American Revolution had reached its decisive military moment. The war was not technically over yet, but the political reality had changed. Britain could continue fighting, but winning the war had become increasingly unlikely. Peace negotiations were coming. Today, news can travel around the world in seconds. In 1781, news traveled by horse and ship. Imagine a rider leaving Yorktown. Imagine the message carried in his hands. The British had surrendered. The Americans had won. The news traveled north, then east, then across the Atlantic. Eventually, it reached Europe. In towns and cities, people reacted. Some celebrated. Some were shocked. Some wondered what would happen next. In Britain, the political consequences were serious. The government faced a difficult question. How long could Britain continue the war? How much would another campaign cost? Was it still possible to defeat the Americans? The answer became increasingly clear. Negotiations were necessary. The fighting did not instantly stop. The British still held positions. The Americans still had armies. But the path toward peace had opened. Peace negotiations took place in Paris. American representatives included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They faced difficult negotiations. They needed Britain to recognize American independence. They also wanted favorable boundaries. They needed economic arrangements. They wanted the new country to have room to grow. Britain had to decide what it was willing to surrender. France was still America's ally, but the American diplomats also had their own goals. The negotiations were complicated. Years of war had created bitterness. Many people had suffered. But diplomacy slowly replaced warfare. Preliminary agreements were reached, and finally, on September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The war was formally ended. The 13 colonies were no longer British colonies. They were now an independent nation. The United States of America. A new country had entered the world. Independence sounds simple, but for the people living in 1783, It raised many new questions. What would the new country look like? How would it be governed? How would the states cooperate? How would taxes be collected? How would debts be paid? How would trade work? How would the army be maintained? And what would freedom mean for different groups of people? The revolution had created a contradiction. The leaders spoke of liberty, but slavery still existed. Women had supported the war in many ways, but they did not receive equal political rights. Native American nations had their own territories and interests, but the new United States would increasingly push westward. The revolution had not solved every problem. It had created a new political system. But a political system is only a beginning. The young country still had to build itself.
Not every colonist supported independence. Some supported the British Crown. They were called Loyalists. They lived in all 13 colonies. They could be wealthy, they could be poor, they could be merchants, they could be farmers, they could be officials. Some believed the revolution was dangerous. Some feared chaos. Some believed that staying within the British Empire would offer greater stability. The war therefore divided communities. Two neighbors could hold opposite political views. Two brothers could disagree. Families could split. Some loyalists left the new United States after the war. Some moved to Canada. Some went to Britain. Others remained. This is an important part of the story. The American Revolution was not simply Americans against foreigners. Many of the people fighting for Britain were themselves colonists. The conflict was also a civil war within colonial society. There was another deep contradiction. The revolution was fought in the name of liberty, but slavery remained a central part of colonial society. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans and African Americans lived in the colonies. The war created opportunities and dangers. Some enslaved people escaped to British lines. British authorities offered freedom to certain enslaved people who joined or supported the British cause. Others fought for the American side. Some sought freedom afterward. The revolution did not end slavery. That would take many more decades. Yet the language of liberty introduced powerful questions. If people possessed natural rights, what did that mean for people held in slavery? If government required the consent of the governed, who counted as part of the governed? These questions would remain in American history. They would eventually become central to another great national crisis. But in 1783, the new country had not solved them.
Native American nations had lived across North America long before European colonization. The revolution affected them deeply. Different native nations made different decisions. Some supported the British. Some supported the Americans. Some attempted neutrality. Their decisions were based on their own political and concerns. For many native peoples, the greatest danger was not simply whether Britain or the Americans would win. It was what would happen to native lands afterward. When the British recognized American independence, the new United States claimed enormous territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. Expansion would follow.
native communities would face increasing pressure. So the American Revolution had very different meanings for different people. For many patriots,
It represented independence. For loyalists, it represented loss. For enslaved people, it created both danger and opportunities for freedom. For native nations, it created a new geopolitical reality. History is rarely one story. It is many stories happening at the same time. Women rarely stood at the center of the battlefield, but the revolution could not have happened without them. Men went away to fight. Women managed farms. They ran businesses. They cared for children. They produced clothing. They preserved food. They nursed the sick. They supported military camps. Some women followed armies. Some carried messages. Some became political writers. And some openly argued for independence. The war changed expectations. Women were not given equal political rights, but their contributions became increasingly visible. The revolution changed the political language of the new country. And in the years that followed, women would continue asking what those ideas of liberty and equality should mean for them. Imagine a continental soldier. He wakes before sunrise. The ground is cold. His uniform is worn. His shoes may be damaged. He has little food. His musket is heavy. He is far from home. Perhaps he has not seen his family for months. He does not know when he will return. He does not know whether the war will be won. He only knows that the army is still fighting. Thousands of ordinary soldiers experienced something like this. The famous generals made the plans, but soldiers carried them out. They marched. They built forts. They carried ammunition. They dug trenches. They stood guard. They fought. They became sick. They froze. They starved. And many died. The revolution is remembered through names like Washington and Jefferson. But the nation was also built by the unnamed soldier, the man whose name disappeared from the records, the woman who cared for the wounded, the farmer who donated food, the sailor who carried supplies, the blacksmith who repaired weapons. Their stories are quieter, but they are part of the revolution too. Washington was not undefeated. He lost battles. He made mistakes. His army sometimes collapsed into retreat. But he understood something important. The Americans did not necessarily need to destroy Britain. They needed to survive long enough. Britain was far away. The British government had to send soldiers across the Atlantic. The war was expensive. If the Continental Army remained alive, the rebellion could continue. Washington therefore became a master of endurance. He waited. He retreated when necessary. He fought when the opportunity was right. He protected the army.
he kept the cause alive. At Valley Forge, he endured. At Trenton, he struck. At Yorktown, he coordinated a coalition with France. Washington's greatest achievement was not a single brilliant battlefield maneuver. It was keeping the American army alive for years. Without that, there might have been no American victory.
While soldiers fought in America, another war was happening in Europe. The War of Diplomacy. Benjamin Franklin became one of the most important American diplomats. He traveled to France. He met with French officials. He helped secure financial and military support. He understood that the American cause could not survive only through battlefield courage. It needed international recognition. It needed money. It needed weapons. It needed ships.
Franklin also became famous in Europe. His image became associated with the American experiment. He represented something new, a political movement claiming that a distant colony could become an independent republic. His work helped connect the revolution in America with the international politics of Europe. And without French support, the war would have been much harder.
Thomas Jefferson was the principal drafter of the Declaration of Independence. He was young compared with some of the other leaders, yet he possessed a powerful ability to express ideas in language that could move people. The Declaration did not create American independence by itself, but it gave the Revolution a clear political purpose. It explained why the colonies believed they had the right to separate. It presented a vision of government based on rights and consent. And because the document was written during a war, its words carried enormous risk. The writers did not know whether the revolution would succeed. If Britain defeated them, the Declaration could be treated as an act of treason. The men who signed it were making a dangerous commitment. They were saying, "We are no longer asking for reform. We are claiming independence. And now we will fight for it."
Before independence became widely accepted, many people feared it. Separation from Britain seemed dangerous. Britain was powerful. The colonies had limited resources. Why risk everything? Thomas Paine's common sense helped change the conversation. Paine did not write in complicated political language. He wrote directly. He challenged monarchy. He questioned hereditary rule. He argued that the colonies had the resource to become independent. His pamphlet spread quickly. People read it in towns. They discussed it in homes. They debated it in taverns. Ideas can be powerful. Sometimes a revolution begins with a weapon. Sometimes it begins with a sentence. Britain was one of the most powerful states on Earth. So why did it lose? There was no single reason. The war was extremely expensive. The colonies were geographically large. The British Army often had to operate far from home. The Americans did not need to occupy Britain. They only needed to prevent Britain
from permanently defeating them. French support changed the balance.
French naval power was especially important at Yorktown. The Americans were increasingly experienced. The war became unpopular in Britain, and the longer it continued, the harder it became to justify enormous costs without a clear path to victory. The British could win battles, but winning battles was not enough. They needed to crush the political movement behind independence. They could not. The Americans, and eventually, Britain chose peace. Yorktown was important because it brought together nearly everything the American Revolution had become. American soldiers, French soldiers, American leadership, French naval power, years of military experience, diplomacy, engineering, artillery, and patience. The surrender of Cornwallis did not mean every British soldier immediately left America, but it showed that Britain could no longer easily win. The war had become too costly. The political situation had changed. Yorktown was therefore both a military victory and a diplomatic victory waiting to happen. It created the conditions for peace. September 3rd, 1783. The Treaty of Paris was signed. The American Revolutionary War was formally ended. Britain recognized the United States as independent. The new country was no longer a collection of colonies. It was a sovereign nation. Imagine that moment. After years of uncertainty, the future was suddenly different. There was no British governor waiting to direct the colonies, no parliament making colonial laws, no royal authority governing the 13 states. There was a new political reality: the United States. A name that had once been an idea was now a country. But a country still learning how to survive. Imagine waking in 1783. The war is over. The sun rises over the Atlantic. Smoke from a small fireplace rises into the cool air. A farmer walks outside. Birds are calling. A horse waits near a fence. The road is quiet. There is no army marching down it. No cannon. No alarm. The country is poor. The government is weak. The future is uncertain, but there is peace. The people who have lived through the revolution now face a new challenge. They must build a country. Independence was only the beginning. The first national government operated under the Articles of Confederation. It was a loose system. The individual states remained powerful. Congress had limited authority. The country had debt. Trade was complicated. There were disagreements over Western lands. There were questions about taxation. The revolution had created independence, but independence did not automatically create stability. The leaders would soon discover
that governing 13 states could be harder than fighting 13 colonies. In 1787, delegates would gather again.
A new constitution would be written. But that belongs to another story. Tonight, our journey ends with independence. Imagine walking across an old battlefield years after the war. The soldiers are gone, the tents are gone, the cannon are gone. Grass grows where armies once stood. Trees rise where soldiers once marched. Birds sing where muskets once fired. A quiet river flows past. The land remembers nothing in words, but history remains. At Lexington, men stood in a village green. At Concord, soldiers fought near a bridge. At Trenton, Washington crossed a freezing river. At Saratoga, a British army surrendered.
At Valley Forge, soldiers endured winter. At Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered. And afterward, the Treaty of Paris created peace. The places remain. The country remains. So, who did America fight to become independent? The answer is Great Britain. The 13 colonies fought the British government and British military forces during the American Revolutionary War. But the story was not simply America versus Britain. American loyalists fought on the British side. French forces fought alongside the Americans. Native American nations made their own strategic choices. Spain entered the wider war against Britain. And the conflict took place across a much larger global struggle. Still, the central military opponent of the American colonies was Great Britain. The war began in 1775. The Declaration of Independence was adopted in 1776. The decisive American and French victory came at Yorktown in 1781. And formal recognition of American independence came with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. That is the road. A long road. A difficult road. A road filled with uncertainty.
Freedom has a price in history. For the American Revolution, that price was measured in lives. Soldiers died in battle. Others died from disease. Families lost fathers. Children lost parents. Communities were destroyed. Trade was disrupted. Farms were damaged. People were forced to leave their homes. The revolution created suffering. It also created hope. These two things existed together. The revolution was inspiring and painful. It was idealistic and violent. It promised liberty, yet it left slavery untouched. It declared equality, yet many people remained excluded from political power. History becomes more meaningful when we can hold these contradictions together. The revolution mattered enormously, but it was not perfect.
it was a beginning.